This is Lesson 15.3, Absolutism in Austria and Prussia. What were the social conditions of Eastern Europe, and how did the rulers of Austria and Prussia transform their nations into powerful absolutist monarchies? College Board Topic 3.7, Absolutist Approaches to Power. Explain how absolutist forms of rule affected social and political development from 1648 to 1815. Absolute monarchies limited the nobility's participation in governance. We've seen that. But they also preserved the aristocracy's social position and legal privileges. The place is Eastern Europe. Time frame is 1650 to 1740. Key players of Eastern European sovereignty: Ferdinand II, Frederick William the Great Elector, Frederick I, Frederick William I, the Soldier King, and Ferdinand III. Key concepts of Austrian and Prussian sovereignty: serfdom, the Junkers, estates, commercial crops, and militarism. Absolutism in Austria and Prussia. You could make this a comparison thesis if you were doing an LEQ. There were several similarities between France and Eastern Europe, you might say, regarding how their rulers transformed their nations into powerful absolute monarchies. However, the differences were more significant. Both France and Eastern European rulers achieved greater sovereignty by forming large standing armies, increasing revenue with high taxes, creating large professional bureaucracies, and expanding their borders. These were the things that France and Eastern Europe had in common. In France, however, Louis XIV centralized his authority by undermining the high nobility, empowering the common people, for example, the merchants and the craftsmen, and promoting mercantilism. In Eastern Europe, rulers also centralized their authority, but they did it very differently. They did it by reaching a consensus with their high nobles. And they did it by repressing the common people and the urban classes. And they also did it by supporting serfdom. That's really our story. What do we mean when we say Eastern Europe? We mean Austria. We mean Bohemia. We mean Prussia. We mean Hungary. And, of course, Poland. But we don't really mean Russia. There were two major dynastic families. You had the Hohenzollern, and you had the Habsburgs. The big economic paradigm in Eastern Europe consisted of, number one, strong nobility, and number two, serfdom. Let's talk about the Black Death. The Black Death had caused a severe labor shortage in both East and West. That's going way back. And for the survivors of the Black Death in the West, it meant economic opportunities elsewhere. Nobles had responded to this by gradually giving peasants more rights and higher pay. And many peasants had even acquired enough land to support themselves. And the consequence was that peasants' economic position increased. But for survivors in Eastern Europe, it also meant economic opportunities elsewhere. So therefore, nobles responded to that by forcing peasants to stay where they were. In other words, a gradual return to serfdom between 1500 and 1650. Laws had been passed that said that runaways could be captured and returned to their lords. And so the consequence for Eastern Europe was that peasants' economic position eroded. But here was the biggest difference between Western Europe and Eastern Europe. In Western Europe, as we have seen, the monarchs and the nobles were in constant competition with each other. Sometimes the nobles won, as in the Glorious Revolution. Sometimes the monarch won, as in Louis XIV. But in Eastern Europe, in Prussia and Austria, monarchs managed to work things out with their nobles. And this was because these Eastern European monarchs had something to offer their nobles which the Western European monarchs did not have, and that was the fate of their peasant serfs. Monarchs forged a consensus with their landed nobles. They said basically, let me build and centralize my power. Let me have my huge state army. Let me have my taxes. Let me repress representative bodies, the estates or the parliaments or the congresses, etc. Let me extend my borders, and in return, you can do whatever you want with the serfs and the towns. You can have a strong nobility, and you can have total serfdom. So the nobles got to have unlimited power over their serfs. They got to be the exclusive instruments of justice over their serfs. They were judge, they were prosecutor, they were police and jailer. And the nobles controlled every aspect of their serfs' lives. Serfs couldn't relocate. Serfs couldn't marry without permission. Serfs were sometimes forced to marry by their lord, and serfs could be sold to another lord. Separation from your family was common. The nobles could force their serfs to work for them for free up to 6 days a week. They decided what would be grown on their land. Nobles were not interested in crops that their serfs could actually eat. Instead, they wanted commercial crops that they could sell to the English and to the Dutch for cash. And so food prices rose for the serfs because there was less food for them grown. Less actual food grown meant that the price of food that was grown went up. The nobles bypassed local town markets. Foreign merchants could afford to pay more for produce than those local town merchants could. And so the nobles sold their produce to the foreign merchants instead. And so towns actually began to shrink as a result. So noble landlord supremacy increased without all that competition from towns. And nobles had this power even on church lands. The Habsburgs. How did the Habsburgs begin to consolidate power in Austria? Well, they were still the heads of the Holy Roman Empire. But the Holy Roman Empire, as we discussed, their power had been vastly reduced in the Peace of Westphalia. They ruled their ancestral home still of Austria and Bohemia and parts of Hungary. And they were still staunchly Catholic. The Habsburgs in Austria and Bohemia and Hungary. The Habsburgs, as we know, had been the big losers in the 30 Years' War. They had tried to eliminate Protestantism in the Holy Roman Empire. They had failed badly to do that, and the Peace of Westphalia stripped them of much of their power as Holy Roman emperors. Now the Habsburgs only had very limited power in Germany, so the Habsburgs decided to concentrate on state building in their ancestral kingdoms. They still had Austria, Bohemia, and half of Hungary. Austria was solidly Catholic. Bohemia had been largely Protestant due to the Hussite Revolution. The Habsburg absolutism in Bohemia. During the 30 Years' War, Habsburg Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand II had managed to stamp out Protestantism in Bohemia. Ferdinand II had replaced Protestant nobles with good Catholic nobles, and he gave them their land holdings. And he was the one who recently elevated them to nobility. So these Catholic neo-nobles owed their success to Ferdinand II. And they allowed Ferdinand II to increase his power over their Bohemian estates. In return, Ferdinand II gave his newly elevated Catholic nobles total control over their serfs. And life for the serfs worsened. Serfs had to provide 3 days a week unpaid labor to their noble lords. Ferdinand III in Hungary. Ferdinand III organized a permanent standing army. He reestablished Habsburg borders along the south and the east. And from 1683 to 1699, he, quote, helped the Ottomans retreat from Hungary. The Ottomans had reached the end of their strength in 1683 with their second failed attempt to conquer the capital city of Vienna. And so Ferdinand III retook all of Hungary, and he also took Transylvania. But the Habsburgs encountered limits to their supposedly absolute power in Hungary. Like France, various succeeding Habsburg monarchs also got bogged down in the War of Spanish Succession from 1700 to 1713, and this distraction gave some Hungarian nobles the opportunity that they needed to revolt. Transylvanian Prince Francis II Rákóczi led a Hungarian War of Independence against the Habsburgs from 1703 to 1711, which came close to succeeding. Rákóczi's War of Independence. Rákóczi became Prince of the Estates Confederated for the liberty of the Kingdom of Hungary. They minted their own coins. They had their own diet. And the Habsburg Emperor Charles VI barely defeated Rákóczi in 1711. Rákóczi's War of Independence was finally ended by the Treaty of Szatmár. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI replaced Rákóczi as King of Hungary, and Charles VI restored the Habsburg family as monarchs of Hungary. Rákóczi went into exile, eventually working for the Ottomans. Today, Rákóczi is a Hungarian national hero. Even though Hungarian nobles were technically defeated, they got enormous concessions in the treaty. Nevertheless, the Habsburgs made great achievements in state building in their own lands and even to a lesser extent in Hungary. They established a strong sense of national unity among the nobles throughout their lands, and they established staunch Catholicism throughout. German became the official language of the state. Vienna became a political and cultural center. It had 100,000 people in it, and it boasted the Versailles-influenced palace of Schönbrunn. The Hohenzollern in Prussia. Here's an evaluative argument you could make in an essay. While France, Austria, and Prussia all grew large armies, the most militarized nation was Prussia. Prussia began with a ruler who was not even a king, but an elector. And in 3 generations, Prussia went from a nobleman with a few provinces and titles to one of the most respected military states in Europe. Duke Frederick William Hohenzollern, the great elector, was not a king. And this is important. His name was not Frederick, it was Frederick William. His own sovereign was technically the Holy Roman Emperor, and his title was Elector of Brandenburg, and he lived from 1620 to 1688. Frederick William Hohenzollern had 3 German provinces in his possession. He was the Elector of Brandenburg, which had the city of Berlin in it. He was also the Duke of Prussia. Prussia and Brandenburg weren't even attached to each other. There was a whole bunch of Poland in between them. And the city of Königsberg was in Prussia. Also, Frederick William had some smaller holdings along the lower Rhine. 2 maps that show just how spread out and disconnected Prussian territory started out as. You've got the red right here on this map on the right, and look how spread out it is. You had the Duchy of Prussia, you had Brandenburg, and then you had some lower Rhine stuff. Each of these provinces had estates, and estates are representative bodies. Estates, as we know, tend to frustrate monarchs because estates never give them anything without demanding some of their authority in return. Frederick William Hohenzollern couldn't tax without these estates' permission. In Brandenburg and in Prussia, these estates consisted of 2 kinds of representatives. They consisted of the landed nobles, called the Junkers, and they also consisted of representatives from the various towns. On the other hand, if you could figure out how to get your own income stream, well, you don't need to ask the estates for permission to tax. In fact, you might not need to call these estates together at all. Louis XIV, as we know, was brilliant at raising his own revenue, and he never called the Estates General in France together one single time. The question for Frederick William Hohenzollern was, how do I weaken these estates and consolidate my own power? And in 1660, Duke Frederick William found a way: divide and conquer. Town representatives versus younger representatives. So Duke Frederick William made a separate deal with the landed Junkers in the estates. And this deal was very similar to that of what the Habsburgs did with their nobles in Austria. It was very typical of Eastern Europe. By 1688, the Duke of Prussia and Elector of Brandenburg, Frederick William, had tripled the state revenue. He had a 30,000-man army, and that's a big army for a population of just 1 million people. Duke Frederick William's separate consensus with the Junkers in the estates was this: he persuaded them that Prussia was under the threat of Russia, France, and the Ottomans, and therefore he needed to have a permanent standing army. He also needed unlimited authority to tax, and in exchange, the Junkers would get two things: total authority over their serfs and positions in the military. And this agreement between the Junkers and Duke Frederick William, Elector of Brandenburg, undermined the amount of representation that the towns got to have in these various three Prussian estates. The Junkers were going to vote against the towns for whatever Duke Frederick William, Elector of Brandenburg, wanted every time. And so by this means, Frederick William began to dominate the towns one by one, and he slowly eliminated the town's representation in the various estates. Then he created an income stream by taxing the goods and services of these towns. They had less representation in the estates, so there was little they could do about it. And he gradually became financially independent of the estates altogether. Frederick, the son of Frederick William the Great Elector, he lived from 1657 to 1713. Prussia's 30,000-man army was a great help to the Holy Roman Empire during the Spanish War of Succession against France. And as a reward, the Holy Roman Emperor crowned Frederick William's son, Frederick, crowned him Frederick I, King of Prussia in 1701, no longer just Duke. So the Hohenzollern rulers were now kings. King Frederick I's son was Frederick William I, the soldier king. Even though he had the same name as his grandfather, Frederick William the Elector, this Frederick William is still Frederick William I, not the second. And that's because his grandfather was not a king, but a duke and an elector. So Frederick William I lived from 1688 to 1740. He took Prussian militarism to a whole new level. He turned Prussia into a modern-day Sparta. King Frederick William I made Prussia into one of the most militarized states in all of Europe. He himself lived a disciplined military life. And King Frederick William I was very attracted to the military lifestyle. He wore his military uniform everywhere he went. Military parades were the popular entertainment. By 1713, you could be drafted into the army for life. By 1733, all Prussian men, number one, had military training, and number two, were in the reserves. Frederick William I's government bureaucracy likewise functioned with precise military discipline.